Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Jay and Noah, for inviting me, and all the organizers for putting together this wonderful conference. Before I begin, I would like to take a moment to remember Baruch Thaler, a friend, colleague, and teacher to many of us here today. Baruch was a pioneer in the exploration of Judaism and psychedelics, and he would have had much to contribute to this conference. Chaval al da'avdin v'la mishtakchen. He is sorely missed. That the states of consciousness produced by psychedelic substances appear to be similar, if not identical, to experiences described by mystics and religious visionaries is something that immediately struck the pioneers of psychedelics in the 1950s. Since then, the question of the relationship between religion and psychedelics has remained an active area of interest and exploration. Are psychedelic experiences religiously relevant? And if so, how might psychedelics be integrated into existing religious traditions? In the following brief remarks, I would like to revisit these questions, particularly as they pertain to the Jewish tradition, and suggest a new framework that might prove helpful in addressing them. Like most religious traditions, Judaism contains examples of non-ordinary states of consciousness. Biblical and post-biblical literature preserve accounts of visionary experiences, and many Jewish mystics throughout the centuries have described what appear to be altered states of consciousness. The Jewish mystical tradition would thus seem to provide a useful analog for exploring how psychedelics might be integrated into Jewish practice. However, while there are a number of examples of altered states within the Jewish mystical tradition, they're actually rather few and far between. As is well known, Jewish mystics were quite reticent about whatever experiences they may have had, and the vast literature they produce contains relatively few descriptions of mystical experience. More importantly, they rarely describe techniques or practices for attaining such experiences. It seems that while mystical experiences may have been valued by Jewish mystics, they did not necessarily cultivate them through specific methods and techniques. However, if we turn from mystical writings to the literature produced within the Jewish magical tradition, we find a very different picture. Unlike mysticism, magic is a practical type of lore concerned with procedures designed to achieve concrete results. Jewish magical literature preserves a vast array of techniques and rituals for a wide range of practical purposes, including the induction of various forms of religiously meaningful altered states of consciousness. Now, I should note that the terms mysticism and magic are notoriously problematic, and it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to strictly differentiate between them. My use of the category of magic here is primarily heuristic and aims to shift the discussion of religion and psychedelics from experience, which is typically associated with mysticism, to technique, which is a defining feature of magic. In fact, in many cases, what we usually refer to as mystical techniques actually derive from magical traditions and practices. Thus, one of the very few clear examples of mystical techniques in the Jewish tradition, those developed by the 13th century Kabbalist Abraham Abulafia, are actually based on earlier magical traditions that Abulafia combined with certain yogic practices and various philosophical and mystical ideas. While as a staunch rationalist, Abulafia distanced himself from the magical tradition, his techniques nevertheless retained a close link with their magical origins. And it seems that this was at least part of why Abulafia and his voluminous writings were banned by more mainstream mystics. His techniques offered the possibility of altered states of consciousness to anyone who would perform them. They turned divine revelation into something potentially open to all. Now, it is precisely this aspect of magic that makes it a particularly close analog to psychedelics. The efficacy in both cases is both automatic and indiscriminate. Psychedelics are substances that invariably and inexorably lead to altered states of consciousness, affecting all who consume them, regardless of their social status or moral standing. And magic makes very similar claims for its techniques as well. Mystical traditions, on the other hand, differ from psychedelics on both of these accounts. First, they do not generally present mystical experiences as automatically inducible, even when techniques are involved. Rather, they are described as the result of divine grace and election. Second, mystical traditions are not usually made universally accessible, but are restricted to those deemed religiously and morally worthy. To get a sense of the difference I'm trying to highlight between what we find in the mystical traditions and the magical ones, consider the following ritual found in two magical manuscript collections from early modern Italy. The text preserving the ritual begins as follows, and I quote, This is the book of holiness and the procedures for entering the orchard, paradise, composed in brief by the holy man Samuel the priest, and this is an otherwise unknown figure, who attained a lofty level and wished to benefit others. He stated the following: "Heaven and earth are my witnesses, that if anyone, whether man or woman, Jew or Gentile, directs his heart to the fear of God and combines sacred names properly, then the Holy Spirit will immediately rest upon them, and their intellect will connect with the supernal beings. And do not say that it is improbable that in our day a person's intellect should be able to cleave to the supernal effluence. As long as a person distances themselves from the concerns of this world, secludes themselves, and contemplates the supernal realms on certain specified days, they will apprehend the nature of the essence. And there is no one in the world who has engaged in this procedure and has not attained great illumination." The text then goes on to describe a month-long ritual based on astrological and Kabbalistic principles, at the center of which is the recitation or combination of a series of magical names and the invocation of angels at certain auspicious times. In other words, we have here a magical technique for inducing a religiously meaningful altered state of consciousness that is explicitly presented as universally accessible and invariably effective. Indeed, these two features of the text may well be the reason it was preserved in the magical rather than the mystical tradition. Now, this is surely a remarkable text, but it is not unique, and there are various other examples of clearly magical techniques for religiously meaningful altered states preserved in magical writings. One hugely popular magical technique that aimed to bring about a specific, non-ordinary state of consciousness was a form of dream incubation known as Shelat Chalom, a dream request or dream inquiry. The technique involved preparing an amulet or performing a magical ritual prior to going to sleep, by means of which the individual hoped to induce a dream that would contain the answer to the question or query. Many hundreds of such rituals and techniques for dream requests are preserved in magical collections. Many of these are intended for mundane goals, like discovering the identity of thieves or the location of buried treasure, but quite a few are for more religiously oriented aims, like communicating with angels or attaining knowledge of divine matters. In quite a few of these, the goal appears to be not merely the passive reception of information in a dream vision, but the more interactive oniric condition known as lucid dreaming, in which the dreamer maintains or recovers a measure of waking consciousness and volition within the dream. In such cases, the dream itself is transformed into a discrete altered state of consciousness. As with other magical traditions, the efficacy of these dream requests is generally predicated on the techniques employed, rather than on the moral qualities of the person performing it. In other words, it is presented as something universally practicable. The Jewish magical tradition is thus an important resource for understanding the place of altered states of consciousness within Jewish culture, and I think it has much to contribute to the discussion on the integration of psychedelics into religious life and practice. The magical literature preserves techniques for a rich variety of altered states and reveals previously unconsidered contexts for their transmission and practice. In addition to broadening the framework for exploring the relationship between psychedelics and religion, these traditions can suggest new ways and new contexts for their integration. As a type of lore concerned with individual empowerment, magic is also an analogue that is perhaps more resonant with contemporary individualistic and universalistic sensibilities than our mystical traditions. And finally, the magical tradition's deep engagement with diverse healing practices that address both body and soul can serve as a source of inspiration for emerging forms of Jewish psychedelic shamanism and other psycho-spiritual therapies incorporating psychedelic substances. On the other hand, the comparison with magic also highlights some of the challenges of integrating religion and psychedelics. While magic was ubiquitous in traditional societies, as an independent and unregulated source of power and authority, it was also treated with a great deal of ambivalence and suspicion by established social and religious institutions who viewed it as a potential threat to society or to normative belief and practice. Psychedelics are frequently treated with similar suspicion and for similar reasons. They have the potential to disrupt the social and moral order, and we are all familiar with how quickly they were associated with counterculture and demonized as a threat to society. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that integration is not possible. And here again, I think the example of magic may prove instructive. Despite its inherent resistance, religion often does adopt and integrate magical traditions. One of the most prominent examples of this in the case of Judaism is the Hasidic movement, where magic played a crucial role both in spiritual practice as well as in everyday life. However, it is important to note that when religion does manage to integrate magic, it tends to regulate and restrict it, and this typically comes at the price of individual empowerment. In the case of Hasidism, magic became the prerogative of the movement's leaders, who used it to promote a particular set of doctrines in a rigidly hierarchical social structure. Considering this fact, should we be concerned about something similar occurring with psychedelics as well? Although I think certain features of psychedelics make them more resistant to becoming a mere tool of the establishment than magic, the potential for them being used to promote problematic values or social realities is nevertheless quite real. One of the main challenges to integration that a comparison between magic and psychedelics thus highlights is the inherent tension that exists between such individualistic practices and religion as a social institution. Or to put it another way, to what extent is the question one of integrating psychedelics into religious traditions, and to what extent is it rather one of integrating religion into psychedelic practice? This is, of course, a facet of the perennial struggle between society and the individual, between tradition and innovation. And these tensions can never be fully resolved, but must be negotiated, and negotiated anew in each generation. This is a difficult task that requires great wisdom and insight. As a cultural phenomenon that has long grappled with these very tensions, the magical tradition has much to teach us about how we might navigate this challenge of integrating psychedelics and religious traditions. Thank you.